It's a great pleasure to welcome Minni, Jain, and Philip Franses. They're authors of the new book, The Language of Water, Ancient Techniques and Community Stories for a Water-Secure Future, and they're co-founders of the Flow Partnership, a non-governmental organization based in the UK that helps local communities implement nature-based water infrastructure on their land. The guiding principle is that every community, no matter where on the planet they are, speaks the language of water. Water is this universal language, and everybody has deeply rooted traditions about how to use water sustainably. So what the Flow Partnership does is they help people get the process going where they, as a community, decide what they want to do to have more sustainable water structures on their land, and then they connect them with the resources and the funding to get it done. The book, The Language of Water, is full of just incredible and fascinating stories. Definitely worth reading. It was great fun for me to read. And it was just published by Synergetic Press, which is right here in Santa Fe. They are offering a 15% discount, and we will be giving details about how you can access that at the end of the podcast. Welcome, Minni and Philip, to Down to Earth.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria Charlotte. Very pleased to be here.
It's great to have you. Now, the two of you have written this book, The Language of Water, about how people all over the world are using traditional methods of water engineering to hold water in the landscape and improve agriculture and water availability in general. You're both part of the Flow Partnership, which we'll be talking about on today's program. How did you each come to this work?
A few years ago, we were looking at what the basics of life are, and one of the absolute basics of life is water. And sometime in 2011, when we started really focusing the work of the charity, looking at water as the fundamental for life, one of the invitations that came to us was to speak at a water conference where we were asked if we wanted to invite any particular water hero we had in mind. So we had heard about the work of Rajendra Singh, who had revived many rivers in Rajasthan with community wisdom. And so we invited him, and it was an absolutely momentous meeting because we'd heard of all the work in water conservation, all the different ways, the water cycle and all those things, and water engineering and how you build a wall to stop floods. But really seeing the work of communities in India using their traditional wisdom, building interventions in the landscape and holding the water so that the landscape could revive was a first. And just seeing the sheer scale, the landscape level scale of the work that the communities were doing. And with those traditional interventions in the landscape, they actually revived 7 rivers. And that really was the starting point for the Flow Partnership.
Now, Philip, you were a mathematician, is that right? Or still are, I guess.
Yeah, very much so. And I was teaching holistic science at a college here in Dartington, an ecological college, and you always talked about the crisis and this sort of wrestle in mankind between technology and the world he lives in. And when Minni and I first contacted Rajendra Singh and the work he was doing in India, there was an immediate question, well, why aren't we doing this? Why are we just talking about this when communities around the world are really wanting to do this work and they know how to do this work, and yet we're not empowering them to do it? So when I saw that action was possible, you didn't have to just talk about the work, I immediately got really excited, and we also got very curious as to why was this work not happening all around the world, because it was such an obvious solution to many of the crises and the challenges we read about every day in the newspaper.
And one of the problems, and you discuss this in the book, is that there's a gap between the sort of academic political world and the people who, give talks at the United Nations and that kind of thing, and people who are more maybe traditional indigenous people doing incredible work on the ground, but aren't in those circles, and therefore the work doesn't necessarily get known to the wider world.
We titled the book The Language of Water, and often it is language not the language of water, but language which is a barrier between people who make policies and the politicians and all the UN type of meetings that go on, and the people on the ground. So communities often don't speak even the languages of the culture, but even more than that, the language of science and research does not filter down to the people who live on the ground and do the work. So the two seem to have got separated at some point in time, and so they inhabit different worlds. And that's a real challenge, whereas the language of water is universal. It's spoken in the landscape. You hold the water in the right place and it will recharge the underground aquifers. It will recharge the landscape. And that's no different in India or in Africa or in America or in Europe, it's a universal language. So somewhere we need to come back to reading the language in the landscape again and being able to speak it together again and not be separated by our cultural languages or our education levels or our research levels or scientific levels and so on and so forth.
Right. Yeah, the previous guest on this podcast was a man named Bill Zedike, who's doing these very simple, low-tech water holding structures in the landscape, very similar to the kind of work that you describe in this book. And the principles are basically the same. You hold water on the land when it rains or when the snow melts or whatever, instead of letting it run off, using structures like ponds and rock dams and things like that. How do those techniques compare to a more industrial approach to water engineering? Because I think, we're in this cultural moment where people really believe that, you bring in the big earth movers and the big pipes and the kind of muscle, and you can do anything. But this is a really different, fundamentally different approach.
I would even go as far as to say that what we seem to think that it's either one or the other, which is not true at all. You need both. So there are areas where there is a tremendous problem and you need engineering works and you need proper engineering to understand what level of technology or technique that will be useful to stop a particular water-related crisis or a problem or a challenge. But what we forget is 60 to 70% of people live on the ground and they live in small villages, and each one doing their bit in terms of the kind of structures that Bill described in his podcast and the work that he does is very similar to the work we do and that we say should happen in collaboration with. So you can do both. You need to do both. It's not one or the other. So this has been happening for millennia, long before the earth movers, long before the engineering work started happening. Communities lived on the land and looked after their water sources. There was also a fundamental deep understanding of water meant to us. So they looked after the water cycle. And of course the population was also smaller and they were smaller villages. So we say you need both. You don't need one or the other. It's not one is better than the other. But in the larger context, sheer numbers of people living on the land, if we enable them to really do what they can at their level, that's more than 50% of the battle won.
Yeah, and maybe just to add that engineering often works in a very sort of abstract way. There's a time schedule of several years and events are planned in that time scale, and that's a very rigorous way of working. But often with communities, it's an innate wisdom that their relation to the land, that they know kind of what to do. And it's a different type of participation, which is able to bring amazing results. And as Minni says, that's an addition to the engineering mindset that can often play a huge part in rebalancing the current state of climate balance.
Well, let's talk about the climate balance for a moment, because one of the things that I think doesn't get talked about enough when we talk about the warming that's happening is the warming. Yes, there's warming happening through greenhouse gas emissions, but there's also warming happening because of the disruption of the water cycle. Explain that to us and how this kind of work can and does cool the earth through doing water cycle restoration.
We did a project with IIT Kanpur and Leicester University using satellite data to measure the temperature in a very hot region of India, but with ample water. So there were many rivers coming from the Himalayas, and they built these system of canals that distributed water to all the villages. And in the area we were looking at, there was this very surprising difference in temperatures, that in the north of the area, the ground temperature was 5 degrees cooler than in the southern part of the region. And when we looked into it, when we went to talk to the communities, we found that the canal was silted over and wasn't being looked after. And so there was no water. They could not grow rice. And so there was no evapotranspiration happening. While in the north, the canal was running, there was running water going into the rice fields, and there was a significant cooling effect happening to the water, because in the water in the leaves being turned into gas and going into the atmosphere, energy is taken up. And so the solar energy is dispersed into the atmosphere and it cools the earth. So when we talk of 1.5 and 2 degrees heating because of the carbon layer in the atmosphere, that's ignoring this other effect, that we've stopped cooling the earth through evapotranspiring, running water through forests and leaves. And once you've got dead soil, as you know, when you're in a city on a hot day, the temperature rises enormously. So there's this tremendous potential to achieve cooling by doing this water work at a big scale.
So, the world is obsessed with carbon, and yes, of course, carbon's a huge problem. But as Phil described, prior to carbon is water. If you don't have water, then actually nothing lives. And even the sequestration of carbon needs trees. It needs water. The trees need water to grow and have their full life cycle before they die down and go deeper and deeper into the soil. The soil needs water to remain healthy and to hold more water. The entire planet works on the water cycle, the big water cycle, which is the planetary water cycle, and the small water cycle, which works at the micro level of all the little villages and the settlements across the planet, including cities. And the problem with cities, which we'll refer to just now, is it's concretized. So water has no space to go into the ground, and it just runs away. You put it into drains and it runs away out to sea. So there's a huge heat island already created on all the cities of the world. On top of which, of course, as lesser and lesser water goes into the ground, there's less and less greenery on the planet. And so the earth is drying up. There's enough research out there telling us now that the aridity on the planet has increased X%, Y%, it keeps increasing because we are not looking after the small local water cycles and the planetary water cycle. So the amount of water circulating through the atmosphere, through the leaves, through evapotranspiration, through the running water, through the rivers, through the wetlands is decreasing and decreasing, and that's the loss of the water cycle, which is absolutely adding to the huge increase in temperature on the planet.
I think one of the really important things that we need to really talk about directly is the fact that when you're doing the kind of work that you're doing, it's a holistic thing. It's not going in to fix one problem and then maybe going in to fix another problem. It's looking at the whole system. And there were some beautiful examples of that in the book. Like there was an example, I can't remember which African country it was, but the people there were thinking about things together. There was the cyclone, there was school children, the fields, there was the homestead, the water, the seasons, all of those things need to be thought of together. And that seems like it's really a big part of the work.
Yes, always. We live in communities. We don't live isolated, no? And nature works in communication with all its various parts together to give us this beautiful planet to live on. So it's similar with us. When we live in communities, we work together to keep our local climate and planet healthy. So it has to be done holistically. When you deal with one challenge, if there is no water, then the whole structure breaks, not just of the environment, the structure of the water, the structure of the community, the structure of what keeps a community alive and together. Take, for example, a really arid area and a really arid village, and they don't have water. What happens? So first of all, there'll be no agriculture, so there won't be enough food to eat. There'll be no livelihood. What do people earn? How do people earn? So often it's the men who then have to go away to a city, leaving their families behind, who have no food to eat or water to drink. And then you have the women who, I'm talking of really, really poor areas. And so women who are left behind are prey to being trafficked. Children don't get enough nutrition, so they develop illnesses and diseases. So the whole social structure breaks. So within all these challenges, where's the time to actually have a cultural life? And families are split apart, and the region gets drier and drier and drier. So multiple layers of transformation need to happen. And this is anthropocentric. You look at also flora and fauna. You don't get herbs, you don't get animals don't get food. So the entire structure of life breaks. So it has to be thought holistically. You can't think only in terms of only water or only carbon or only the impact is multi-layered. It has to be thought in a holistic fashion so that the whole thing revives.
Yeah, and often, indigenous cultures up to 100 years ago had a holistic view of the forest, of the spirits of their children and what they needed to maintain for the sake of their children. And this isolated thinking came in afterwards, where it tried to separate things out, like we need timber for the railway lines or for housing, and so we'll cut the forest, and then we want to do agriculture in a certain way with fertilizer, so we'll look at that separately. And then the village, well, it's better that people do as they're told, so we'll look at that separately and have a policy for that. And so 100 years ago, it was a holistic view of life, and that's become very fragmented and separated into different disciplines. And now it's incredible when you see that when you give a pond to a village, how that village transforms and it returns to its holistic kind of structure. And the women become confident, they run the meetings, they bring back the people from outside who've gone to the cities because there's agriculture. And the communities know how to live holistically. Holistic is not something we've invented. And it's our kind of fragmentary mindset that we've taken to such an extreme that has kind of interrupted that way of life.
And that fragmentary mindset is often in service of natural resource extraction, it seems like.
Always.
Oh, yeah.
A colleague of ours says, and you can hear him almost saying, looting, exploiting, and extraction, they all go together. And that's the kind of education we're also teaching these days. Whereas holistic education actually allows, for example, if there is a wetland, leave the wetland full of water. You need, in certain places, you need more water than is required. So you understand the link between all the parts, and then you can bring back a holistic planet. So you have to be mindful and sensitive to the linkages between each of those parts. And that's why holistic is the right word. Often holistic is taken as, yes, those wellness gurus, but holistic is the way the planet works. We wouldn't have the planet if nature didn't work holistically. And so I think our education is not just the language of water, it's learning the language of that interlinked holistic way of living on the planet in mindfulness and collaboration with other beings on it. And then let's see what happens.
One of the things that is a challenge is that, and you write about like when an engineering project might come in, they've got the skill set of putting installations in the ground, in the water, whatever, but not necessarily of building community and talking to people. And that's very much part of the work and part of the skill set that's needed to restore the water cycle in different places.
Okay, so I can give you a story of that in India. We were doing this project with this organization called Arup. They're civil engineers, very, very good civil engineering firm, which also is very interested in the natural systems and the natural way that communities manage their landscapes and the water. And yet they are civil engineers and they do huge civil engineering projects. And we did a project together in the backyards of Rajasthan in a really, really dry, arid, and completely almost dead area together. And what was really interesting was that we had these engineers there with us, and we had the villagers, and of course the two languages are different. And yet, at one point, one of the engineers asked one of the villagers who was part of the project, he asked the villager, so how do you know when you're laying the foundation of the intervention, which is like an earthen bank, how do you know how deep to dig? And it was a beautiful moment where we had scientists, engineers, villagers, social work, all of us gathered together, and there was this silence. And then after about 3 minutes, the villager just looked at the engineer and shrugged his shoulders and said, I just knew. And to the credit of the engineer, he also accepted the answer. He knew in his heart and his whole being that what the villager said was right. So the two disciplines sort of came together in that. And that's that moment when you go beyond what you have learned. You know exactly what level of wisdom and knowledge is required to make that change.
I was struck by some of the stories that you tell about, for example, in Africa, where colonization was not just about turning the land into extractive farming or extracting natural resources, but also really destroying features of the land that people used both for practical purposes like farming and also for spiritual purposes like trees that were used for shade and were also the places that spirits were thought to live. And when those things are destroyed, I mean, that's a lot to heal from. You're healing not only the land and water, but really, you know, your own sense of who you are as a people. And that's a big job. And that's part of this whole process.
Yeah, I think that's really true. It's something we discovered, especially in Africa, and then in writing the book and looking at the research, that there are these two completely different views, that the aim of colonialism was to manage the land, to drain the land, take the water off the land, because it's a kind of threat. You can't control water if there's too much of it. So it was to bring in a situation of control and then fill the land with crops and maximize productivity. And this approach was sort of 180 degrees opposite to the traditional way of living with water in the land. And as you say, it was a language that was a whole story of creation that involved both the gods, the spirits, the community, the children, the education, the looking after the land. And it was incredible that the colonialism mentality was 180 degrees opposed to this. It was almost trying to overwrite it with its own story. Another example is the Aboriginals, who had a whole system of spiritual relation to the land around them and how to take care of it through the extremes of climate. And again, this was totally overwritten by another culture of sheep rearing and huge farms and allowing the trees to go and using water as a resource, not as something sacred. And again, there's almost no comprehension in modern Australian culture that there was an indigenous culture before that existed on quite other lines of understanding and acting and relation to the world. So this was a real discovery in writing the book, that these two approaches to the land of control or of respect and surrender to the forces of nature were so completely juxtaposed with each other. And that once the colonialists went in Africa, then it's been a huge struggle to try and put together the pieces for each farmer, for each village, of how that society used to function. And really, the old story is now too fragmented to be effective in the way that it was. So it desperately needs a new story of what is water, what is our relation to the spirit, what is our relation to the world, but also including of technology, including of our maps and our sciences, but able to bring us back into a unity that can support us in the world in a sustainable way.
A lovely story comes to mind from our visit in Africa to that same area where the cyclone had decimated the whole landscape. And one tends to think that it would be technology that would help them. And yes, of course, it did. There were many, many international NGOs and organizations, even the UN, that gave in money to help them sort out all that had been destroyed. And yet, somewhere bubbling away under the surface, in that same area, was that respect for the spirits of the ancestors. And when we visited, the day we visited, it was a Sunday, and very early in the morning we were visiting the different projects where the water had been held very successfully and had regenerated. And somewhere in mid-morning, one of them asked us, the mayor and the village chiefs are actually this in the morning. There is a harvest festival going on, and should we go and say hello to them? So we said, of course, we'd love to say hello to the mayor and be part of the festival. And so when we arrived there was a sweet gathering, and there was a beer that was being brewed in the corner, and it was bright sunshine. We had a great conversation. They said, would you like some of the beer? For me, 11 o'clock in the morning, beer just wouldn't go down the hatch. However, everybody was having a good time. They said, oh yes, this is beer which has been brewed, which is from the local grain over here, and this is done in a particular way so that the spirits of our ancestors are also honored. And so there was a whole cultural and ancestral wisdom around it. And then casually one of them said, and this is really to herald the start of the rainy season. So we can guarantee you that 100% within 24 hours of the festival today, and the beer and the honoring of our ancestors with this beer, there will be rain. And I remember looking up at the sky. It was bright blue. There was not a single cloud in the sky. And I'm thinking, yeah, right. Certainly it looks like it's going to rain. And then we went about our day, and it was wonderful. And, periodically we bumped into various others. And it was just such a beautiful, beautiful whole village. And by evening, we were tired. We had our dinner, and at about 9 o'clock went to bed. There was hardly any electricity. In fact, the electricity went. And I am not joking. At about 10:30, there was thunder started, lightning started, and then the heavens opened up, and there was such a storm that I have never actually seen before. And so, that connection, that link between the spirits, the ancestors, the land, technology, water, the village, everything was still alive and functioning. Obviously, the communication lines there were working. So that really, it says something that nothing dies down ever totally. It does bubble away and comes up when the time is right.
That example was such a beautiful passage in the book. And it made me think about the fact that science completely, disdains spirituality or that kind of connection and will insist that that's a coincidence and so on. But, what we have when we have our sort of fragmented, unholistic thinking, we have a crisis of meaning. We have a crisis of connection. We have isolation. We have consumerism as a kind of false meaning that we put into our lives. It seems like that's connected to the kind of reductionist thinking that science gives us, which is good for lots of things, but it's not the whole picture.
Yeah, I think that's a critical thing, is that if science is not by definition about reduction, so holistic science in which our experience is involved, and that this expression of unity that the African is giving voice to in their own way, that has to be there in any view of the world. You do not arrive at a world in which you only have fragments and then try and put those fragments together in meetings and reports. You have to have some window in your science on what is the world holistically as a unity that is everybody's to address. It's both the scientists, the artists, it's also the plants, the trees. Everything has the ability to express itself through the essential unity of existence. And as you say, if you do not have that, then you're left with something that is really dysfunctional, because you have so many specializations, so many different jargons and words that you can't communicate anymore. What is your whole aim as humanity or as a part of the living world?
We have a saying in India, Mary Charlotte, that even the scientist who is the biggest atheist and does not believe in the sacred or God, but if he or she is doing an experiment which is absolutely critical to them, I'm sure somewhere in the back, just before the results come, there is a little prayer that goes up and that says, please God, let it work.
Right. I think, another piece of, I think it falls under holistic thinking because there's such a parallel to medicine, and that is, it makes more sense to prevent catastrophic events before they happen in the same way that we try to prevent illness before it happens. But the dominant paradigm right now is just, doing what you do, and then, oh no, there's a flood, there's a drought. Send in the crews to mitigate the disasters. But what you're talking about is disaster prevention and keeping in balance before the whole system breaks.
A bit of both. I mean, now the system breakdown is so huge that you have to actually now go in to manage the disasters, more than manage, to regenerate so that that disaster is averted. But also where there is, it's still fine, that is where you have to start thinking in terms of, we don't want to become flooded or we don't want to become arid. So should we, where do we plant more trees? What in the system is now facing a gap that we can plug before we reach that level? So yes, you have to do both. The kind of climate breakdown that we are having today, we have to get more and more of our communities to be able to do both disaster management, but also to make sure that they continue living in areas where they're living a healthy life, that they continue to be able to do so. And I think that fragmentation that we were talking about earlier, sometimes life has become such a big challenge in terms of livelihoods, in terms of schools and money, and in terms of living itself, that one tends to forget, and that fragmentation takes hold. So hence, if you have farmers who can no longer farm on their farms and are forced to go to the city and work as laborers, we've lost farmers. So who will look after the land? So these are, in a funny sort of unjoined up thinking where we don't think that then becomes a challenge for the land. So we need to start joining up our thinking and plugging those gaps before the disasters happen.
Yeah, and maybe to add to that in our engineering mindset, time is something abstract. It's just a variable which you can plot on an Excel sheet, and you can put in all the timelines of when things have to happen. And it's a disaster then when that Excel spreadsheet goes wrong and something happens that shouldn't happen at that point in time, like a flood. And then you try and fix it with another timeline. But that isn't our experience of working with communities. With communities, the first step is often that the fragmentation of different individuals with different views dissolves into a whole goal that the whole village is behind. And once they do that, they're unified in their aspiration of how to realize something together. And it's no longer a fragmentary, abstract Excel sheet that they're following. It's their common goal and the actions that together can build the pond, can re-sow the fields, recharge the aquifers, and bring the community back together. This happens as a whole movement. And this is really the difference with the engineering mindset, which wants to abstract time and then make it controllable, and that you can partition it to different bodies to do the work. So this is really kind of at the center of what is different in the community endeavor.
As Bill Zedike said in our last podcast, he says, yeah, you take that mindset in and the ecosystem laughs at you, or the watershed laughs at you.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Well,
Well
give us an example, Philip, of what that looks like on the ground. Like, you go to, let's say, a village. Is it your job, you and Minni and the Flow Partnership, to help those people come to unity? Are you telling them what you think they should do? Are they bringing back their indigenous traditions? I mean, what does that process actually look like?
Well, it's quite amazing. Like when we went to Ireland and there was a huge flood near Kilkenny, and everybody was shocked because restaurants were flooded, cafes were flooded. And we went to a meeting with the whole community, with the chairman of the council, the pizza owner, the landlord of the area. And you could see in the shock of that event, everybody was enthused with wanting to do something, wanting to work together to realize a change. And it's this kind of shock is the same in India, that we try to work with partners who are specialized in this type of transforming a shock of a drought or a really hot year or a flood, as in the case of Ireland, and transforming that into a unified energy that's able to overcome all obstacles, because the strength of the will is so strong once it finds itself that it wants to rebuild the agriculture and get the water available again and get the community whole system working.
One of the first things we do is we don't come in with a solution. That's the first thing to keep in mind. Currently, we are looking at reforesting 125 square kilometers of a completely arid periphery of a national forest where the cheetahs have been resettled. And the area, if you looked at it, you could not imagine that it used to be a forest. It's so completely dry. But the process which we follow is, one, we work with organizations who are already working in that sphere in the local area. So that relationship with the villagers is already there, a respectful relationship. The second thing is, we don't do anything until there have been lots of community consultations with the villagers. So until they come on board, until the villagers are absolutely sure that they are equal part of the project, we don't start the project. Because the project ultimately has to be theirs. They have to own the project, and they live on the land. They know what to do. They know the flows of the water. They know where to build the water bodies. They know where to build the interventions. They know what impact that water will have on them. And so until they are willing to join in, it's just a top-down project. So we don't do that. Actually, we say the best day comes when they say, right, now you guys have done your bit, go away, we'll manage the rest. We'll look after the rules of conserving the water. We'll look after, you've given us enough training. You've given us self-reliance. You've given us the ability to be confident to manage whatever life throws at us now. But it's something that they had an equal part in. They brought their traditional wisdom and their own labor and their excitement, their energy, their experience, their work. So I think in that process, that's a really crucial piece. Without that, then it's just charity. It's you giving them something and they just taking it. They're not a partner in it. You want partners in it. That's where in the climate change debate as well. You know, wherever we work, we have to work in partnership with those who live on the land. And then they bring what they know and you bring what you know. And if the two together make something even more meaningful, then there is real magic.
What is it that the Flow Partnership brings? What is your role?
So one is landscape level vast thinking. It's you embed it in the small local. So I'll give you the example of the 125 square kilometers. So actually, I was in India for another project. A film was being made on the work the women are doing in the different villages. French film TV company was doing. And we were going from one part to another, and it was 60 to 70 kilometers of this completely dry, arid area. And far in the distance, I could see a line of trees. And a casual questioning with the driver said, oh yeah, ma'am, this used to be full of trees. And, you know, there was a famine and the people were thrown out of the forest. And so this land is like that. And that's where it begins, you know, that vision that it used to be a forest. Can it not come back to becoming a forest? Why is it so dry and why is it so arid? And so from that point onwards, you know, you do the research, you find out who, what's needed, bring people together, actually get that vision and the project formulated and happening, and get everybody in to join in, to become part of that, so that it becomes a common endeavor to actually not just bring back their livelihoods and lives, but in that process you regenerate the area, the land, the climate and the planet. And it's that, it's not just for them. When you regenerate one part of the planet, you generate, its impact is felt in the climate across the planet. So our work is bringing all that together with the local partners. Otherwise, each one is doing their own little thing. How do you bring it into a whole?
I mean, it sounds in a lot of ways like looking at the kind of global water situation as a jigsaw puzzle, and you just put one little piece in place at a time, and then another little piece, and another little piece, and pretty soon it starts to form a bigger solution than just like the village scale.
There is a method there as well. I mean, there are two things. Actually, we say the Flow Partnership has two main purposes. The first one is water literacy. You've got to know what to do. And the second is just knowing isn't enough. You actually have to do it. So, a lot of communities we work with in different parts could be, isolated and not connected, and yet they are. Some of them know what to do, and some of them would like to know what to do, and yet there is no way for them to teach each other. So we've started what we call water schools, which have an online representation as well as physical water hubs in India. And there's a water school in India, there's a water school in Africa, where every country, the hope is that every country in Africa will be represented by the people doing work there, where communities come and they bring their success stories, their methods, and what they've done to regenerate their landscapes and teach other people in other communities. So these are forums for community knowledge and wisdom to get exchanged. And then the second part of it is, of course, that once you know what to do, once the villagers, the communities, the different countries, they know what to do, they need to do it. And often you work with communities who really don't have any funds or means to be able to do it. So we work to be able to bring or enable the resources to flow to those communities. So it'll then become something that is actually, water is actually being held on the ground. And over a period of time, when enough number of communities do that, it is a web that is created, slowly on the ground. Our vision is that that web will then cover all the dry lands and the flooded lands of the planet through the community action that's happening.
I mean, that is kind of the question. I sort of made an assumption that web was, in fact, the vision that you held, and it sounds like it is. But, I mean, working on a village scale, especially in more industrialized countries like the United States, like so many places in Europe, how do these techniques work? How are those relationships different than in places like India and different countries in Africa and so on, which are less urbanized and which still do hold more traditional knowledge?
Well, there are obviously cultural differences, and there are also legal differences, So different countries have different laws. But one of the things I find that if I look at how difficult it is for communities in certain countries, because the laws that they have don't allow you to do this, and you can't collect the rainwater because especially in America, it belongs to, the rights of it have been sold to somebody else, and it's illegal to hold the water on your land. Those kind of things are huge challenges. And yet, if you start with what is possible, which community can do it, it catches a life of its own. So the web increases. And one of the projects we did in India, the one that I was describing with Arab in Rajasthan, in the backyards of Rajasthan, with the same thought of the water school, we looked at creating language neutral tools which could potentially be a method that is being used by villagers in India to regenerate their landscape, hold the water and bring it back to life, the area back to life. Could this be something that could be understood by, and we went to Colombia, La Guajira region, which is also very arid and very dry, and showed them, it was through a film, and showed them the film, just wanting to test whether A, is it understood, B, would they copy it, was there some kind of replicability, was there some kind of crossover. And I'm really more than happy to say not only all those words, but instead there was also, they came back with what they did, what their traditional wisdom was. And so again, that language of water comes up again and again. So within your cultural differences, within your traditional wisdom, the language of water is universal. So those communities in Colombia absolutely understood what the communities in Rajasthan were doing, and the very first thing that happened was a sense of solidarity. Look, there are villages over there in remote India they'd only heard of, and us in terms of what we are doing to be able to bring back the water. So I would say, yes, cultural differences are great, celebrated, traditional wisdom can be different, but the language of water is very similar, and it's how you use that language of water to express it in different cultural ways, which I think we're beginning to shine light on, and part of the book covers that.
Maybe you can both talk about what is your vision for getting this work out into the world on a larger scale, because I mean, it's important to do one small project at a time, and yet it's only going to be effective on if it's truly scaled across continents. What is your vision for doing that?
That's a sort of critical point in humanity, that our old story is no longer able to sustain us in a comfortable manner. And so the work we're doing is trying to add to this effort to create a new story in which we re-understand our relationship to nature, to society, to our own potential as humanity, really from the ground up, because we're at such a crisis point of confusion and not knowing our direction clearly. And so I see the work as part of this effort to clarify and to renew what is of value in science, in the indigenous stories, in our relation to nature, and what else is happening in experiments that people are doing, in creative efforts in art or music or painting, and how can we form a new kind of synthesis that will sustain us and the children and the children's children for many years to come.
I agree completely. An isolated project is not enough by itself. And yet that web I was talking about earlier, that you have to work at a landscape level. So the river will not revive with one intervention of one earthen bank. The river revives when there are 400 or 500 such structures built in the flow pathway of the river, and which allows the water to not just recharge the underground aquifer, but also then feed into the river, and the river, which was dead for 80 years, comes back to life and flows perennially. And so the work is the same. With the starting of the different water schools with local communities, it's held in local hands. Local communities are teaching each other, and actually the number of projects that are beginning to happen within those areas, and people don't even have to be connected to the water schools, but the kind of spread of that wisdom from community to community that's happening will enable, you won't see it physically, it won't be in our control, but it is enabling a lot more work to happen on the ground. Now, the other one big challenge that this work faces, which we find globally, is the amount of funds that go to communities is very little. Yeah. So you can have this brilliant project of 125 square kilometers of regenerating a whole landscape and a forest and have a research station over there. And yet, often there isn't enough money that goes down into these projects to enable them to happen. So locally, each country where there is a node, where communities start beginning to do the work, one is they need to think at landscape level, and second is to enable sufficient resources for that landscape level work to happen. And that's what we see as a future vision, that it becomes decentralized. The more decentralized, the better. The more communities are able to do this work, the better. And the more water literate we become, and the more we share that, then the planet has a chance. And that's the vision we hold within the work of the Flow Partnership and the water schools.
And I think it's important to mention that this work is so much less expensive than the kind of big project engineering alternative, and it does seem to last potentially forever.
Absolutely right. One is it costs a fraction of the cost of a big engineering dam, for example. And secondly, you don't even need to look after maintaining the dam, because actually the work, these interventions are done by the villagers, and they don't want to go back to that state of drought or flood again. So the maintenance and conservation all those things we talk about in terms of sustainability are held in the hands of the villagers themselves, the communities themselves. So you're absolutely right. When we can do something at the fraction of a cost, which can be preventative, not just damage control or curative, and it can be, it's like a crowd source of, it's spread over the communities of the whole planet. So it has to be decentralized, and it has to cost this little, and it has to use their wisdom and their energy to make this happen.
I have a friend who spent quite a lot of time in Australia and was adopted by an Aboriginal tribe and got very deeply into the stories that they told, and then came back to the United States. And the idea with the Aboriginal people whom she was involved with was that the stories create the world around you. And so then she went back to the U.S., and she was standing in the middle of New York City and looking up at the skyscrapers and said, what story created this glass and steel and asphalt? And she thought about it for a while, and her insight was that the story was the survival of the fittest. And the survival of the fittest maps onto a kind of social Darwinism, which is not necessarily true and certainly not a great story for us. What is the alternative story, or what are some of the alternative stories that will create the world that you want to see?
I think this is really optimistic, that the world is created by our story, and that even though we seem to be at such a dark place, the real work is happening in this recreation of a story in which that story is not coming from us. It's not our technology, our order. It's a greater story of our spirit, of our relation to nature, of our relation to each other. And that once we have a story, just like the village, remember their old story when given the chance, and then come together and recreate a landscape that is helpful to them and can sustain their life and livelihood. So in the same way, this work inspires us to create our own story, because there's nothing stopping us living by a creative story rather than a damaging and sort of small-minded story that the world is just about survival of the fittest.
Yeah, and reality is powered by the imagination. All the stories we have in our imagination, the kind of stories that we want to see in reality, come first from our imagination. And the interconnectedness. So for me, I feel that the stories that make us feel really alive, and what are those stories, and bring them out more and more and more. The second part of it, of course, imagination, inspiration is absolutely the crucial first point. But you do need action. So you need the story, you need the imagination, you need the inspiration, and that's not enough. You do need to pick up the spade to start digging the ground. And I find that one of the challenges is that we get lost in the beauty of the story and forget that we need to take that step to make that story a reality.
Right. Minni, Jain, and Philip Franses are authors of the new book, The Language of Water, Ancient Techniques and Community Stories for a Water-Secure Future. Thank you so much for being with us on Down to Earth.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You can find out more about Minni and Philip's work at theflowpartnership.org. You have to include the word theflowpartnership.org. And you can order the book from Synergetic Press. It's called The Language of Water, and Synergetic is offering a 15% discount. Just enter DTE15 at checkout, DTE for Down to Earth. You can also order the book from your local bookstore. Just like we try to buy fresh local food, it's great to support your small press and your local bookstore. You've been listening to Down to Earth. We would love it if you would support this program, which you can do by going to patreon.com/down-to-earth planet to plate, where you can sign up for as little as $3. Patreon is Patreon. And also please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. The Quivira Coalition is a not-for-profit and a community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to regenerative practices that produce healthy food, support meaningful livelihoods, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Quivira and how you can support their work, visit quiviracoalition.org, Quivira. And finally, this show is a production with the Radio Cafe. You can check out radiocafe.org to hear back episodes of this show and also find all kinds of other shows on a wide variety of topics as well. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.